What are Americans talking about when we talk about the Indo-Pacific? We used to kid that it's the region that stretches from Hollywood to Bollywood, but we've since actually expanded our geographic conception of the Indo-Pacific, and it now really roughly aligns with India's geographic conception. So that's to say that the Indo-Pacific includes East Africa, it includes the Gulf, so more than Hollywood to Bollywood, it's really now California to Kilimanjaro. Okay, so it's a broader area. Second, what does President Trump mean when he talks about a free and open Indo-Pacific? So he's talking about cherished principles. He's talking about the principles that make this region, as he put it, quote, a beautiful constellation of nations, each its own bright star, satellites to none. Satellites to none. So in other words, a free and open Indo-Pacific is really, it's not a bloc, it's not a military alliance, it's a principled vision. And it's a community of countries that respects the rule of law, that stands up for freedom of navigation in the seas and in the skies above, that promotes open commerce, that promotes open thinking, and above all, that defends the sanctity of each nation's sovereignty. So a free and open Indo-Pacific, it doesn't exclude any nation, but it does ask each nation to respect and promote those principles that we all hold in common. So it's not really a coincidence that so many of the countries that have put forth their own Indo-Pacific visions are nations with citizen-centric governments as opposed to regime-centric governments. India and Australia have similar concepts. Japan has its free and open Indo-Pacific. Indonesia just last year put forth its Indo-Pacific outlook, which has really caught fire in Southeast Asia. South Korea and Taiwan have a new southern and new southbound policy, respectively. And so each of these visions is unique in its own way, but what they have in common is that they all seek to uphold these same cherished principles. And these visions also pay homage to the idea that Southeast Asia and ASEAN specifically is really the geographic and conceptual center of gravity for this broad Indo-Pacific region. So there are also competing visions out there. We heard a little bit about one yesterday, I think, from the Russian foreign minister. These visions are, frankly, they're less free, they're less open, they're less flexible. They tend to be more hierarchical or even coercive. The quote, Eurasia concept that the Russians seem to be promoting talk a lot about economic cooperation, but they say precious little about the sorts of principles that Maurice Payne was just talking about, that I just laid out, that are at the heart of all of these different Indo-Pacific concepts. The Russian foreign minister even noted, incredibly, he noted that Russia, China, and Iran are forming a little bit of a club. That's quite a trio. They just had naval exercises recently. So that's quite a grouping for you. I mean, what principles do you think that trio talks about when they get together? I mean, seriously, when Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow get together, what's the conversation? Is it what kind of software are you using to facially recognize peaceful protesters in your streets? How do you, how do you mark dash lines on your maps? How to build a better debt trap? So I think it's fair to say that some of those competing visions are not talking about how to better respect the sovereignty of your neighbors.
Let me push back a little on that, Matthew, because that's my job. That's not my position. So, I was reading a document where the American government has recently created a war chest of $60 billion, has renamed its OPEC into IDFC for investing in infrastructure projects in this particular region. And I was going through the terms of engagement for that particular instrument. And one of the line items says preference for US companies or US investments. How different is it to the BRI? If you're going to create a war chest and you're going to privilege American investment over any other investment, so that's exactly what the BRI does.
No, I'm glad you raised that, because the story is actually the opposite of what you're suggesting. It used to be under the American Overseas Private Investment Corporation that you had to use American
Yeah,
companies.
you had to, and now it is preference.
We've softened that to preference. What it means is, if there's an American company that is willing, and this is private capital, to participate in a project, that U.S. taxpayers who are funding our new Development Finance Corp understandably would look to give some preference to those companies. But if there isn't an American player that wants to play, then we'll work with an Indian one. We'll work with an Australian company. We'll work with an Indonesian or Vietnamese company. The amount of capital that is available under the Development Finance Corporation is now, as you put it, $60 billion, more than doubling of the amount. And it also allows DFC to participate in private equity, not just lending schemes for these various projects. So this is something that is designed to galvanize private sector money. You talked a moment ago about, do democracies have the ability to have these grand strategies? Well, in fact, the private sector is what takes the lead. They have the spotlight in free and open societies, and they're the ones who've provided tens of trillions of dollars of capital globally to build the world. We don't rely on central planning or a vanity project of some autocrat to say
You're
we're going
catalyzing the
to
markets to
invest
participate.
there.
Sure.